All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 10, Section 4, Indian Removal. So recall that since the constitutional period, that the United States was primarily a white republic, and this was reflected in a couple of ways. The Constitution, to a certain degree, made the distinction between we the people and Indians, which were labeled as two distinctly different groups. But also later on laws like the Naturalization Act, which in 1790 had essentially set this precedent for quote-unquote free white persons who were eligible for citizenship. This was also compounded by the fact that Andrew Jackson himself had had a history of fighting against Native Americans. There were wars between the Creek Indians, fighting in the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson himself, growing up on the frontier, which was susceptible to Indian attacks, had pretty much lived his entire life as an Indian fighter and held animosity towards Native Americans. This was added because what we're trying to understand here is this policy of Indian removal, how the United States moves towards a much more aggressive policy of removing Indian populations from within the borders of the U.S. Indians in popular culture were also equated to as savages. This was true whether or not, and so these anti-Indian sentiments were true whether you're talking about books like The Last of the Mohicans. This was a popular book which portrayed Native Americans as savages, or artwork, right? This is kind of a good picture illustrating exactly what we mean by this anti-Indian sentiment that was widely held in American culture. And so this combination of not really events, but this combination here pushed more towards the policy of removal, a much stronger animosity towards Indians. The Indian Removal Act itself really stemmed from an issue between Indian sovereignty and state sovereignty. So sovereignty, this word itself, it pretty much means independence. And I'm going to use this map here to really illustrate what's going on. So for example, we're going to use the Cherokee, and I'm not sure how well exactly you can see it. It's not the most detailed picture here, but here you have the Cherokee, right? They occupy roughly this territory here. Now that territory, that land, you can't see Washington, D.C., but we'll put D.C. right here. That land is essentially an agreement between Washington, D.C. and the Cherokee people, and the U.S. government recognizes that the Cherokee can inhabit that land. However, that territory also is within the state of Georgia, right? The Cherokee occupy a large portion of the state of Georgia. I don't know what the heck the capital of Georgia is, maybe Atlanta or something like that. Let's say that's the capital of Georgia. Now, this issue arises when the state of Georgia essentially wants to kick the Cherokee off of their land. So the question is, well, who actually has the right to this territory? Is it, in this case, the Cherokee or the Indians? Or is it the state? And this was primarily concerning what they call the 5 civilized tribes. You could see them essentially listed here: Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Cherokee, Seminole, although I think I may be missing one. But the reason why they were called civilized, because they were the ones who had become very much assimilated into American society. Meaning they had adopted English, they had adopted Christianity, because there was a feeling, certainly that, by some, this was, true in the case of Thomas Jefferson, that perhaps Indians could assimilate into American society if they only farmed like white farmers, if they only spoke the same language like English, if they only became Christian and gave up their indigenous religions, well, then they could potentially be Americans too. And the groups of people like the Cherokee, who were the ones being put under the most pressure to get out of the United States, to get out of Georgia, were amongst those who were the most assimilated. And so this, idea that it was only a matter of assimilation is, it doesn't hold up in this case, right? This is a newspaper that was published by the Cherokee very much to show that they had adopted a lot of aspects of essentially American culture. And so the push to move these tribes beyond that land comes from Congress in the form of the Indian Removal Act. So this is a law passed by Congress and endorsed essentially by Jackson, because Jackson's the president. He certainly has no love lost for the Native American population. And of course, Congress, well, who is Congress made of? Well, Congress is just representatives from the states, right? So you have the senator from Mississippi, the senator from Alabama, the senator from Georgia, the senator from Florida, the senator from Tennessee, the senator of North Carolina. And of course, they want to see that land, which is officially recognized by the U.S. government, they want to see it fall back into their hands. They don't want it to belong to the Cherokee. And what the Indian Removal Act proposes is to remove these tribes and set aside a specific territory in what is modern-day Oklahoma, and to call that Indian Territory. That way they won't be in, and that area right there, Oklahoma, is not a state. It is federal land. Federal land. And so that way, this question of Indian sovereignty and state sovereignty, there won't be any clash there because that land doesn't belong to any states. Now, of course, many, the Cherokee included, and we'll just focus on the Cherokee for now, are not very satisfied with this ruling. There are a couple of cases that reached the Supreme Court. In the case of Cherokee versus Georgia, the Supreme Court rules against the Cherokee. In the case of Worcester versus Georgia, Justice John Marshall, again, who is a Federalist, and if we know anything about John Marshall, is that he advocates for a strong national government, right? He actually rules that, in fact, the Cherokee are distinct political communities, aka rules in favor of the Cherokee. Right, and so this fight over, the Cherokee being able to occupy that land is kind of a perfect example to show how sort of the breakdown of federal power plays out in the United States. So you have the issue of federalism on the one hand. You have states, and you have the federal government, right? And oftentimes they're fighting over various powers. Last chapter, we talked about how they were fighting over tariff policy, tax policy. But within the federal government, you have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, right? This is within the federal government. And in this case, the legislative branch is passing the Removal Act. So they say the Cherokee have to go. The Supreme Court, with John Marshall, essentially says that they can stay. Andrew Jackson, the president, somewhat infamously says, John Marshall made his decision, let's see him enforce it. In other words, the executive is also in favor of removal. And so with the state saying remove, with the executive saying remove, with the legislative saying remove, and only the judicial branch ruling that the Cherokee have the right to stay, the Cherokee are forced to move. And the Trail of Tears is the term used to describe the forced migration of Indians within U.S., right? And this Trail of Tears, again, you can kind of barely see it here, but these tribes are forcibly relocated to the Oklahoma Territory, and it causes 4,000 deaths. 4,000 people died in very extreme conditions: lack of food, lack of water, lack of medicine, really just a lack of disregard for human life, and is certainly probably one of the lowest points in American indigenous policy or relations. This was not done entirely peacefully. In fact, there were a number of conflicts that broke out. Black Hawk's War is just one example in the 1830s. This was occurring in Illinois. You have a picture of Black Hawk here. It was, a U.S. victory, but only increased tensions between U.S. and Indians. And so Andrew Jackson is, largely responsible for this major shift and much more aggressive policy of removal during his time in office.